Hi, I'm Nick Haig and welcome to the B2B Insight podcast. Today I'm going to welcome one of my fellow directors and colleagues, Oliver Truman, to the podcast. At B2B International, customer experience, customer loyalty research is a big part of what we do. So much so that some of the latest learnings have been put into our latest book. Of which, from research that we've carried out with clients, we talked around the 6 pillars of customer experience. And today we've got some very interesting insight from research we've carried out that Oliver's would like to talk us around in terms of what makes a CX leader and what differentiates them from CX laggards. So if I could introduce Oliver.
Thank you, Nick. So I'm Oliver Truman. I'm Head of Research and Analytics here at B2B International. That means 2 things. On the one hand, I lead a lot of different types of programs for our clients, whether those are CX programs or branding programs or anything else. It also means that I, for my sins, lead some of B2B International's thought leadership activity. And one of those items this year has been the regular survey that we do with some of our clients and prospects.
I'd like to start today's discussion, maybe starting quite broad actually. It was a piece of research that McKinsey had looked at, where they'd looked at businesses where they delivered an exceptional experience, and they'd seen that delivered between 30 and 50% more likelihood to go back and do business with those companies again. I think what we see in B2B brands, and this comes from the piece of research we've just done, is that actually 53% of B2B marketers cited that the challenge of delivering an excellent customer experience from end to end. But we all talk of, don't we, Amazon and Zappos and all these consumer brands. But why do you think B2B companies do have this problem in being able to deliver an exceptional customer experience?
I think it comes down to a few things. I think for one very simple fact is the fact that B2B organisations are much later to the party when it comes to CX research or just actually taking the practice of customer experience seriously. Many of them haven't until recently actually invested that significantly in their programs. So it's hardly a surprise that they lack, first of all, some of the insights and intelligence on what it is that makes a good or even exceptional customer experience for their prospects or for the organisations that they're doing work for. But also I think there's some unique kind of structural properties about B2B organisations that mean that it's actually quite difficult to implement really exceptional CX in those organisations. One of those simple facts is just simply that B2B organisations are very, very siloed. They operate in sort of different divisions, different business units. Those business units don't talk to each other very often. And also simply that B2B organisations often grow through acquisition. So they don't organically understand their customers as they're going through that growth process. They bolt on an organisation that may bring them a new capability or something like that. But all too often they don't properly integrate those businesses together, and we'll have some findings actually that we'll be discussing later on around the seamlessness of customer experiences, which actually plays to that point that a lot of B2B organisations are not sufficiently joining the dots together and making things easy for their customers.
Yeah, so it's a lot about the investment side of things in that back office, that processor side of things. Do you think, obviously in consumer markets, then it's one individual. Do you think, for the fact that also the speaking to multiple decision makers, do you think that's plays a part in that as well?
Definitely, and I think one of the things that's been underappreciated in B2B research generally is the idea that there's just a single customer within the organisation that they're dealing with and wanting to sell to. That might be true. There might actually be a touch point only with a single or a couple of individuals within an organisation. But actually the thing that lots of brands don't appreciate is the very wide effects that a decision can have on that single individual. The choice of a particular brand can in many cases reflect well or reflect badly on that individual. There's often questions to do with the integration of that brand's products or services within the wider organisation. The onboarding process is particularly complex in lots and lots of instances. And also, because there's a very wide range of different stakeholders within these organisations, it's actually really difficult to properly understand all of the interests and actually very often the politics that exists with all of those different people's interests. Yeah. One of the classic ones, which is still very, very common within B2B organisations, is just the challenge or issue that exists to do with salespeople, that they're often the ones who are charged with going out, seeing customers, dealing with them, interacting with them on a day-to-day basis. And they quite rightly feel as if they know everything about their customers. Bringing them along on CX programs and helping them to realise that they perhaps don't possibly understand everything about their customer, or at least they don't understand everything about all of the other people that their customers deal with within the organisation, is a really, really important thing to impress upon organisations. So there's kind of good knowledge in a lot of B2B organisations about the customer, but it's often incomplete, and that's where they start to fall down.
And I think that incomplete nature and you know, the sales force and investing in processes, we both know from the projects that we design that the starting point is you know, that CRM database in which to target and speak to customers. And it's surprising, isn't it, in B2B markets how many companies don't have that centralised CRM system, of which, you know, not only do they know their customers, but they can then use that to market to and you know, through the different touch points, understand how they're interacting with them.
Well, you and I both know this, because if, you know, we're doing a CX program for a customer, we're going out, we're wanting to survey some of those people at those customer organisations, the difficulties that we have in getting sometimes our clients to just pull together a list of their customers, or even to pull together a list of not just the immediate customer, but who else in the organisation are they dealing with? What's the networks that are going on within that customer organisation? Yeah. It simply doesn't exist still. So there is a huge amount of catching up on just some very basic processes that lots of B2B organisations need to do. That's not to say that all organisations are in that position, and as we'll see later on, there are some organisations who are leading in this respect much more than other organisations who are perhaps we might regard as being laggards in some respect.
Yeah. Well, I think building on that, and you know, 5 years ago we did some initial research that came about that we saw these 6 key pillars, if you like, of customer experience, starting from, you know, commitment, you know, from the top down in terms of, you know, if the leaders don't believe in it, don't invest in it, through to, you know, we've touched on seamlessness, but, you know, fulfillment. There's these 6 different pillars. Do you want to just touch on which of those pillars, what they are, and then we can, I suppose, use that to delve into this new finding, new piece of research that we've carried out.
Sure. So the 6 pillars, I guess it probably helps to explain where those 6 pillars have come from first of all. So over the years we've done hundreds and hundreds of different CX surveys for our clients, and 5 years ago or so we took an interest in wanting to understand the kind of secret sauce, the commonalities that exist between the things that really drive customer loyalty. So not just the things that somebody scores highly on, or the things that, you know, an organisation thinks are the things that make a difference, but the actual items within those surveys that lead to long time and very strong customer lifetime value, the sorts of properties that lead to cross and upsell in those organisations. And we boiled it down actually to about 6 different properties, the 6 pillars of customer experience that we thought made the difference. So the first of those within our client organisations is simply their commitment to the practice of customer experience. Is everybody bought into it? Is customer experience a very core and central value to the organisation? Is it something that everybody is judged by? Is the senior team within an organisation on board with the idea of pushing CX programs? You might take that for granted, but actually all too often that isn't the case. So commitment, we thought, was really, really important.
And commitment, like you say, it's not just lip service. It's not just doing a survey once a year and then revisiting that. It's about embedding it within the organisation, within the culture of the organisation.
Exactly that. It's actually taking it seriously. You know, not simply paying lip service to it, as you say. The second of those things is about the idea of fulfillment. So fulfillment's a strange one, because fulfillment is about wanting to actually meet customers' needs, customers' expectations. But actually all too often fulfillment actually means merely understanding the customer's needs in the first place. You know, what are the real drivers, the things that make a difference to a customer? So fulfillment actually is the ultimate goal, but a prior stage before that is simply understanding what those customer needs really are. So fulfillment is the second of the pillars. We've then got this issue of seamlessness that we talked about earlier. So this is where a customer should believe that there is no joins at any point in the process, that one thing flows into another, and that an organisation's systems and the way in which an organisation talks to a customer looks as if it's, to some degree at least, been personalised for them. So seamlessness is the third of our pillars.
And I think to that point, in fact, I was with a client yesterday, and we were presenting some findings. We saw that 60% had a query or a problem, but they argued that they didn't feel that they had any issues. You know, they didn't have a complaint system, if you like, that they were holding on to. And I think that seamlessness is being able to make sure that you recognise that the customer has got a query and being able to deal with it no matter what, isn't it?
So actually, that feeds into the fourth of our pillars, which is proactivity. So this is the idea that organisations know about a customer's needs even before they're able to express them. And actually, organisations have a huge amount of data that allows them to get into what that actually means in practice. Lots and lots of organisations now collect data about the touchpoint experiences, particularly from their digital touchpoints. One of the challenges, though, is simply that they are not doing an awful lot with that data. So they have this huge advantage, competitive advantage potentially at their fingertips, but they're not making best use of it. The other aspect about proactivity and understanding needs preemptively is actually, from our perspective, when we research different markets, different customers, is actually the power of observation, the ability to be able to look at a person in a business-to-business context, a work context, see them go about their work, ask them questions as they're going and doing that, is often the secret way of being able to get into some of those insights that tell us about some of those deficiencies in a process or some of the things that could be improved in a process.
I was just going to say to that point, I think that's where it's so important, isn't it, to embed it within the company, because the culture everyone needs to understand and also have autonomy in a way to be able to deal with problems, look at things, see them from the customer's perspective, and then change them.
Yeah, and actually, just again recalling some experiences, we sometimes, when we're dealing with organisations that have, say, contact centres, it's very useful sometimes to just go and speak to some of the people working the phones in those contact centres to just ask about common problems that they perceive exist within the organisation. And all too often, it's very, very easy for them to express and tell us what those issues are. And then when we relay that back to management, they say, we didn't know anything about this. So that inability of people to be able to feed information up through a hierarchy to management, and for that then to be acted upon, that almost symbiotic way of being able to have customer experience information and some of this stuff to do with proactivity that could really make a difference, just often doesn't happen. So it is about culture and encouraging that more often.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, I know which example you're talking about, referring to there, and for a third party to go in, sometimes we just do it because we've always done it that way. Whereas a third party coming in asking the question, saying, "Why are you doing it that way?" It's like they're the myopia of they're blocked and can't see the wood for the trees in terms of doing things differently.
Exactly. I mean, ultimately, what we're perhaps doing ourselves out of some business here, but ultimately what we want organisations to be able to do is for them to kind of, we're teaching them to fish, we're teaching them to be able to have the skills to be able to spot problems, spot pain points, and then do something about it, rather than having to go through the rigmarole of these big lumbering programmes of being able to find these things out.
So being on the front foot.
Being on the front foot, proactivity, really important. Linked to that is the very simple issue of responsiveness as well, which is the fifth of our pillars. So responsiveness, expectations I think have changed very, very markedly here in recent years, led by people's consumer experiences. They want things more quickly, more personalised is a particular aspect of responsiveness. So B2B buyers are no different from consumer buyers in that respect. They expect things just quicker than they ever have been at any previous point.
Yeah.
And then the final of our pillars is about evolution. So it's actually recognising the point I've just made, which is that expectations are changing all the time. we cannot simply be doing what we were doing 5 years ago and expect that to be something that's going to satisfy or delight the customer. So keeping an eye on what it is that really makes a difference and changing that, and also importantly changing the action planning that often happens on the back of a CX program to reflect those changed expectations is really, really important. Constantly evolving your CX program is vital, we would say.
And from our research 5 years ago, we asked companies, how well they're meeting these 6 pillars, didn't we? And actually the big takeaway was that, well, in a B2B world, the majority weren't doing a good job, weren't definitely, meeting all 6 pillars. And there was some worse than others. I think seamlessness and proactivity were 2 that sprung to mind. It's such a hot topic now, CX. It's talked of, you've got all these consultants that are popping up all over the place. As I say, it's a big part of the research that we do, isn't it? So when we revisited it this time, 5 years on, I was really interested to see, how things had moved, assuming that, CX across these pillars, people would be doing a better job. And actually the findings were really shocked me of what we saw out there. So do you want to give us a feel for how that has evolved in the B2B world over the last 5 years?
Yeah. So it's perhaps worth just explaining a bit of the background to how we ask about organisations' performance on these different pillars. So it's as part of a regular survey that we do. At the end of each year, we ask a range of different B2B marketers, strategy leads within organisations and other senior business professionals about the priorities for the coming year, the sorts of things that they've done well or badly at over that period, investment priorities. And as you say, we asked 5 years ago about the 6 pillars of customer experience. At that time, we found that in terms of organisations that were strong on any of those 6 individual pillars, there was actually no individual pillar where anybody said that where any more than 50% of organisations said that they were strong at any single one of those pillars. The sad thing that we have to report on the back of this latest wave of that survey, so we interviewed about 300 individuals of that similar profile that I've just mentioned at the back end of 2019, is that there's been no real progress on any of those pillars. So again, there is no individual pillar on which more than 50% of organisations said that they would be strong. And actually the pillars that organisations said that they were weakest at, there's also been no real strong improvement. So in particular, the 2 pillars that we talk quite a bit about there, seamlessness and proactivity, it's still fewer than 30% of organisations in both cases where people say that they're strong. Self-reported this is, not simply about going out and actually even asking customers about whether they are strong at these different things.
Why do you think that? I mean, it's with all this money being spent, we've got all these software platforms that people are investing in. Why is it when we in our consumer day-to-day lives we have such good customer experience, and B2B companies aren't able to make the change?
I think a lot of it has to do with that point to do with joining up systems. So very often we find actually, particularly in regulated industries in which we might be doing research, companies are scared witless of changing anything about their core systems. These core systems are very often systems that from the 80s, if you're lucky, they're sometimes from the 90s, and they're slow, they're inefficient, it's difficult to make changes in them, but organisations still rely implicitly on them. And there's been a lot of talk in recent years about the topic of digitalisation and whether or not organisations are ready for this, the progress they're making on it. The bold reality, frankly, is that a lot of B2B organisations have not even started on that journey in any meaningful respect. Or if they have, they've bolted on other systems to that core piece of IT infrastructure, which means that the ability for a seamless customer experience to exist is never going to happen, because one system just doesn't talk to each other, but also it's impossible for that system to talk to another system as well. In terms of proactivity, sadly, I think this also relates to organisations' lack of actually talking to their customers. So lots and lots of CX programs take lots of measurements. They ask people about their NPS score or their customer effort score or how satisfied they are with various aspects. and very often that's done regularly. But it doesn't get under the skin of some of the, or try to preempt some of the problems that customers might be having. It's very retrospective actually, and it's very often framed from the point of view of the brand itself. It's the things that the brand thinks are important to be asking about, rather than really reflecting what the customer wants or thinks. So many CX programs, we would say in our view, could benefit from some more fundamental research really into what customer needs are and what they really want to have improved in that customer experience. Lots of organisations have made pretty good progress on things like customer journey mapping, but that really is just a framework. It doesn't often get under the skin of individual processes, under the skin of individual workflows and those sorts of things that can have a real tangible impact on B2B users' lives.
Yeah, and I think, again, from our experience, we see it lots of companies, they've got the program in place, but they ask the two magic questions, scale of 0 to 10 for the NPS likelihood to recommend, and then why do you say that? But actually that doesn't dig deep enough, and it's just a bit too holistic sometimes as well. That digging deeper, the qualitative research can actually deliver so much more than just those big data metrics.
Sure, and this isn't to disparage collecting NPS metrics. It's important, it's a baseline, it's a pulse check, but it's just the start. And we'll see later on that actually organisations that just do that are often not going to be the leaders that we're looking at as part of this study.
So it's, surely if we look at this data, we've not seen big movements. In some, we've actually seen a fallback, as you say, in some of those pillars. Surely there must be some companies out there that are doing it well. Were we able to uncover, not who those companies were, but what these companies, who these CX leaders are in terms of what actions they're taking?
Yeah, so in the spirit of looking at the behaviours and the attitudes and the things that different cohorts of organisations do differently. We've defined the leaders as being those organisations that are strong at least 5 of our 6 pillars. Yeah. So they report pretty good performance across a range of different things. By contrast, we regard organisations that we would position as being laggards as being those that are not strong at any of those different 6 pillars of customer experience. And then anybody who's in the middle we kind of position as being average in some way. But you're right, it's really instructive to try and understand what it is about leaders that's different, that's special, so that hopefully others can benefit from that secret sauce, that secret formula.
So I suppose the begging question is, and especially to those out there watching and listening, what are these leaders doing? What is it that others can learn from that they can do to really make that change within their organisation?
So out of our entire sample of organisations that we spoke to, it was only 15% that were regarded as being leaders. So that fact, first of all, is worth bearing in mind, that there's a huge proportion of organisations that are just not good at these different pillars of customer experience. In terms of what those leaders are particularly adept at, well, there's 2 things. First of all, and related to our point about proactivity, they have a really strong understanding of customer personas. So they haven't just been through an exercise in which they've put together from the top of their heads what they think customers want or need. They've gone out and asked them. They've gone out and started to understand different groupings of customers, different types of personas, and the ways in which their needs may be different. They've strongly embedded all of those insights from those personas into business process, sometimes reflecting different business processes to different personas. And importantly, those personas are well understood throughout the organisation. It isn't simply the case that they're in a brochure somewhere or in a piece of marketing collateral. Every single employee often is aware of who the different personas are and their key characteristics, so that they know, first of all, how to interact with them when they encounter a customer, but also when they're thinking about developing their proposition. They've got those personas, those customers in mind as they're putting new offers together.
So personas is obviously one of these things that makes these CX leaders stand out. Is there anything else that we've seen from the data that CX leaders could be doing or are doing?
So it again links to one of the weakest areas, which is about seamlessness. And the fact is that leaders for the CX pillars are the sorts of organisations who've got all of the dots joined up. They have a completely seamless tech stack, basically. So whether that's their marketing stack, whether that's their core operational stack, it all fits together, it all works. Yeah. Leaders are very, very much stronger in this respect than even our average organisations. It is the thing that seems to make a big difference between those two cohorts. Another point to make here, though, is simply about the changing expectations when it comes to the channels by which customers interact with B2B organisations. There's a lot of talk about omni-channel nowadays, the ability, if you're working with a builder's merchants, for instance, ability to go into that builder's merchants or to deal online, and for those two experiences to be exactly the same, for the two things to be joined up. That is becoming an expectation now in business-to-business markets. And I'd say probably if there's any single trend that we're seeing over the last 12 months and actually going into the next 12 months, it is the push behind B2B e-commerce much more now than has been the case at any point in the past. Clearly, if more businesses are going to be trading, doing business, selling online, they're going to have to work out how that integrates and interacts with their existing ways of doing business.
And I suppose it goes back to the digitisation point, and it's something that, you know, in the long run, if everything's digitalised on the omni-channel piece, then personalisation of that journey, you know, we know again in our consumer lives how that is, you know, if we're buying products regularly, then the company should know that and be able to either push corresponding products our way or talk of, you know, discounts of around particular products and services.
Well, and it's not just that, it's actually also just the customer feeling as if something's been made just for them.
Yeah.
I think the lack of personalisation in B2B is really a critical issue, and one that they have a great opportunity to sort out. If they're making their first forays really into e-commerce, they have the ability to put in place a best of breed, experience, a best of breed tech stack to support all of that. So they shouldn't miss that opportunity, we would say.
Yeah, and I suppose just picking up on those laggards, they're just doing none of that.
They're doing none of these things. They're doing none of these things.
They might be doing a bit of NPS tracking, but
well, that's really interesting because actually, amongst the fairly substantial, it's about a third of organisations that we regard as being laggards. Lots of them are actually tracking NPS in some form or other. Big insight here is simply doing that in of itself is not something that's going to really make a difference. It's all of the wider activities, all of the wider planning, all of the actual assigning people to particular tasks when a deficiency is found. There's real accountability, there's some very specific goals that are put against that, and then actually that there's somebody who's going to be judged by that at the end of the day or incentivised on the basis of whether those things are done or not. Within laggard organisations, all too often it's just the measurement that's taken rather than the corresponding action that has been put in place.
And I think that's the massive insightful piece on this piece of research itself. How much money is being wasted on, just building these platforms. We know all the usual suspects of Qualtrics and people like that out there that, even to the likes of some people that think they can do it internally on a SurveyMonkey type platform. It's not good enough to just do that. You need to.
Well, it's basically taking measurements for its own sake. They don't in of themselves lead to improvements in any of these metrics. And by the way, this is starting to come to a head. One of Forrester's predictions for 2020, quite a depressing one in fact, is that something like a quarter of CX professionals stand to lose their jobs. I think this is because there is a realisation that there does have to be some proof that all of this works, that proof that this actually leads to some degree of financial improvement in performance. And that it's not just that metric that's tracked for its own sake. It was often said that NPS should be a predictor of business growth. I think simply because organisations are measuring it so often now, that is actually becoming less and less the case, simply because the score itself is just put onto a dashboard somewhere, put into an annual report somewhere, and then forgotten about.
And I think, again, if you ask the question to a customer, they've taken the time to answer a survey, be it online or over the telephone or face-to-face. Their expectations have risen. If people aren't doing anything with it, then they're going to be more disgruntled.
Well, exactly. And there's an extent to which you've got goodwill here from people answering surveys, but there's only so far that you can actually continue doing that. And one challenge actually simply in the research industry more generally is the issue of declining response rates. Not just because of over-surveying, there is the danger of doing that, but also because of this lack of action that actually follows on the back of providing feedback. there isn't the sufficient, what we term the closing of the loop, actually bringing it back round and checking in with the customer and saying, has this issue that you've reported to us been solved? Yeah. Not just solved on that one occasion, but systematically solved so that it doesn't happen again. That's when not just the organisation, but actually the organisation's customers start to see value from all of this.
Yeah. So to bring everything to a close today for listeners and viewers, what advice would you give in terms of, we've obviously talked of different ways that we, people can start to embed and move an organisation forward, but is there any other advice that you could offer?
Well, since we're a research organisation and since we love frameworks, I've come up with a bit of a framework. Okay. So we've got the 5 I's, I'd probably say, in terms of the watchwords for things that organisations should be doing if they want to really move the needle on customer experience. Yeah. The first of those is interest. So this is a bit like the commitment pillar that we had before. We're actually genuinely getting interest from the highest levels of organisations, particularly C-level roles in terms of programmes is vital. Yeah. What we've noticed actually from our surveys is that the C-suite is taking more and more of an interest in customer experience programmes, but very often we suspect this is because they're looking to actually cut the funding or actually prove that there's a return on investment from these things. Yeah. So their interest actually is not necessarily from the right place. It's probably with a view of cross-cutting actually more than anything else. Yeah. So interest, but genuine interest, is really, really vital. Insights, we've spoken quite a lot today about that being important, so that's the second of our I's. Properly understanding the customer, making all of the use of lots and lots of behavioural and transactional data that businesses collect is the key to being able to meet that proactivity pillar that we talked about earlier. Investment, the third of our I's, is really, really important as well. So at the top of this conversation, we were talking about the fact that B2B organisations are only just coming to CX as a discipline, as a programme. And if they are, I think, sadly, we both have experience of this, they don't put the real investment behind it that would allow them to make a real difference. That isn't, by the way, just in terms of the insight collection. It's actually particularly in terms of putting in place the mechanisms to be able to improve things. So putting in place the investment to have a change programme, to have people assigned to that change programme, for it to be a good degree of their time focused on it. That there is a people cost to all of this, and too often it's lots and lots of kind words and not too much action. So investment is really, really important. Improvement plans, I've kind of talked about that, but improvement plans, very, very seldom actually are seen through and to the end. They're very, very seldom actually updated on an annual basis. We've seen lots of organisations, both of us, where an organisation has simply taken last year's improvement plan, updated it a little bit, put some new metrics in there, and then said, let's go for the next 12 months with that. Yeah. We talked about evolution earlier on today, and evolution means that you're going to have to update that fundamentally if there's a shift in customer expectation. So exactly what's done with those improvement plans is a key area for enhancement, for optimization. And then the final one is about incentives, so the fifth of our 5 I's. We obviously don't want to be punishing people if they're not meeting expectations in terms of CX. The service profit chain tells us that good customer experiences come out of good employee engagement and good belief in the programs that are being put in place. Simply punishing people if they don't meet those expectations, we often find, is not very effective as a mechanism for driving real action. So using the carrot more than the stick is obviously an important part of this, but actually having really specific incentives that link through to business process, that link through to some of those things in the innards of an organisation that make a difference is really, really important as well for people to be thinking about.
Well, I think that's brilliant, and I think the 5 I's framework, it can at least leave people with something of which to build a plan around in order to make that change. We could talk forever on this subject, and we'll probably revisit it in future podcasts. But I need to thank you for that, Oliver, because I think it's just been very, very insightful. And I suppose just to bring it to a close, we talked up front, didn't we, about this 53% of B2B marketers really struggling with being able to deliver this customer experience end to end. We then revisited the 6 pillars that we'd originally found 5 years ago, and the dramatic finding is that we've not moved on at all in the B2B world, and in fact, in against seamlessness and proactivity pillars, then actually we're falling behind. But I think looking at those CX laggards versus the leaders, and the fact that there's only 15% of them out there, I think it really does still leave some big opportunity for B2B companies to differentiate in the market by just meeting expectations and going further.
Absolutely. It's still a hotbed of competitive advantage, and more needs to be done. And yeah, it's great that there's loads of opportunity. So we've perhaps been a little bit pessimistic today about the outlook, but actually putting our positive hat on, there's loads and loads of opportunity out there.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed today's session. But as always, we'd love to hear from you. So either get in touch via the email, leave some comments below, and we'll also answer those questions as you post them. So look forward to hearing from you.